Yippee! Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special presentation about why Tavstarius should get together, actually. An unbiased presentation by me, Rooney. I want to note for simplicity's sake that the artist formerly known as Icarius will still be referred to as Icarius in this deck until he can get his shit together and actually pick a name for himself. Also want to note that this is a very text-heavy presentation, and I know it's generally frowned upon to read directly from the slides, but I will be doing that in this case because it will help me stay on track with my thoughts, and also I know you bitches love subtitles, so you're welcome. Now, let us begin. First of all, these three save the world together twice. Gay love can save the world, direct quote from Eyes of the Lamb. Now you might be thinking twice, and yes, twice. First of all, of course, Tavstarius and Icarius link minds to overpower the nether brain, and Tav establishes that it probably wouldn't have worked with anyone else. The second time was a little bit disjointed. Tav merges with Lathander, changing him and preventing him from remaking the world through a deadly apocalypse. But that was only made possible because Astarion followed Tav to the City of Judgment and freed him with his true name. But that was only made possible because Icarius stuck around and repeatedly spoke up despite being an outsider in the group. Take a look here. We got 1, 2, 3 instances of Icarius speaking up to point to the obvious solution in the room. Even when he was physically nervous, he was worried about people turning on him, and even fucking Jahira snapped at him. She's a respected leader, and still he spoke up and asked about Astarion because he knew that was the best solution that he had. Astarion offers the stake to the only person he knows will take it. This further solidifies that Icarius played a key role in saving Tav and, without even knowing it, the world itself a second time. But maybe saving the world together isn't homoerotic enough for you. After all, they also had help from the other party members, Aelin, Isabel, and even Withers. Does that mean they should all kiss? Of course not. But Tavstarius have something that the others don't. Chemistry. Let's take a look at the data. With 3 people, there are 3 different sets of chemistry, which can further be broken down into 6 sets of feelings from one person toward another. There's no question that Tav and Astarion love each other, so we'll be focusing on their individual chemistry with Icarius. Starting with Tav and Icarius. I'm not in love with you now, but I was once, and if I stayed, I think before long I might be again, which would be wise to avoid for both our sakes. Oh. Icarius's mouth twitches into a smile. I'm not sure which is worse, to think that you won't ever feel that way about me again, or that perhaps you could. So don't tell me. Let's leave it in the past. There's an arresting softness to Icarius's gray eyes when he lowers his glass to look at him, and it turns the mead bitter on Tav's tongue. He doesn't want to contemplate the question Icarius posed either. Tav and Icarius loved each other once, so it's not far-fetched to believe that they could love each other again. But wait, isn't the Icarius that Tav knew and loved dead? Well, yes and no. Let's talk about what remains of the old Icarius. And we can split this into 3 different categories: his nature, his nurture, and of course, the dark urge. Now, in theory, someone's nature wouldn't be affected by amnesia. In 33.16, Icarius notices different qualities about himself as he navigates the world. His body feels wrong, but being referred to as he doesn't. He's selfish, he lies easily, he's a bit of a fop, he's a sadist, he's quick to anger, he's susceptible to the thrill of power, and he's worried about hurting a child. Now, one would expect nurture, or how someone has been raised and treated up to a certain point, would be more undone by total memory loss, but Icarius seems to still feel echoes of his nurtured self. Those are the eyes of a child who's afraid of punishment for a wrong she did or a right she didn't do. It strikes a chord in your soul deep down. Everyone should be looking at you, listening to you. You want to bask in their attention, turn it back on them, and render them senseless with the warmth of your approval. And, whether nature or nurture, Icarius also retains his interest in the art of painting. The one thing we know with utmost certainty is that following his rebirth and amnesia, Icarius is no longer influenced by Baal or the Dark Urge. So, we can conclude that some of the old Icarius, and arguably the best parts of him, still remain. He can tell from the glint in Icarius's eye that he's just being glib. Gods, he can tell, because Icarius used to look like that, crooked grin and all, when he was being an ass and knew it perfectly well. Fuck, Tav can't do this, not if it's Icarius in there. Icarius, who should be dead and gone, all traces of the man Tav knew. He thought he could handle this, but that was when he thought he was dealing with a stranger who happened to be wearing Icarius's face. Here we can see Tav himself starting to doubt his claim that the old Icarius is dead. Couldn't it be different? Someday? Tav digs his nails into his thigh. It feels like such a waste. 12 years, I never thought I'd see you again. Now you're back and I'm not, Icarius says. You said so yourself. The Icarius you knew is dead. He's changed his name. Icarius is dead, he says. He's calling himself Finian now. Icarius parrots that same sentiment, that his old self is dead. And he has a good reason. He wants nothing to do with the Icarius that he met in that journal. He wants a fresh start. But that still doesn't mean the statement is entirely true. Remnants of the old Icarius Tav loved do remain. And who's to say Tav wouldn't love the new parts? No, Tav steals his voice. You and I weren't good together. Actually, we were pretty goddamn awful for each other. That's never been more obvious to him than it is now. I stopped thinking about Mary and Beth when I was with him. I stopped thinking about anything at all. And I liked it that way. It was the only way he knew how to be with anyone back then. But that's changed. Everything's changed. Well, there you go, one might say. Tav and Icarius weren't good for each other. And you're right, they weren't. But like the quote also says, everything's changed. You might recall that Astarion and Tav weren't always good for each other either. But Tav is different now, and so is Icarius, especially now that he's free of Baal. But let's go beyond just the potential for chemistry. What if I told you Tav and Icarius already have soft spots for each other in canon? And as you can see here, there is a real tweet that Eyes sent me in regards to Tav and Icarius that says, there's nothing louder than a silence between two people who could have ended up together, but didn't, who still have soft spots for each other. So there you go. Nothing is going to happen between us ever again. Doesn't matter if Astarion's in the picture or not. You need to understand that, alright? He forces himself to watch Icarius's face for his reaction. All he sees is a flash of something like disappointment through those iron eyes. Well, what did he expect? It's not as if Icarius has any real feelings for him. He's just looking for any potential avenue to manipulate his way out of here. So don't feel guilty, Tav tells himself. Easier said than done. Well, Icarius says softly, that's perfectly clear. Message received. Remember that Tav's focus in this conversation is on the fact that he and Icarius weren't good for each other, which we've already addressed. The key takeaway from this exchange is Icarius' reaction, disappointment, specifically paired with Tav's classic, unreliable narrator thought pattern. We can assume that Icarius was disappointed for a different reason than what was assumed, the most likely being that regardless of Astarion, Tav seems to have no interest in him, and or that he was bad for someone who's been cast as the hero. Gods, Icarius says, hushed and breathless, I really did love you. When Tav shared his memories with Icarius, I believe it was a major turning point in how Icarius saw himself, saw Tav, and saw their relationship. Remember that up to this point, the only good thing Icarius had recognized in himself was a worry for Arabella's safety, and everything he'd been told and read about his past was awful. Here, He gets to see a glimpse of who he was through the lens of someone who loved him. And not only that, he's able to recognize the love he had felt in return. It was you. You saw the impossible solution hiding in plain sight, a way to beat the mind flayers at their own game, use their tactics, many minds working as one, but not their form. No sacrifice necessary. Icarius eyes the fresh bite on Tav's neck. All you needed was a man who's obviously completely in love with you, and another who used to be. Once. A long time ago. There are two things to note here. One, Icarius shows sincere admiration for Tav, and two, Icarius overemphasizes the past nature of his love for Tav, which suggests he's hiding present feelings. Perhaps not love, but a longing that he's trying to stamp out. The crowd clears for them. They haven't got a choice, really. Tav takes up even more space now than he used to. It's the farthest thing from polished. He's dizzy, grinning, and he keeps nearly tripping over Astarian's feet. It's wonderful. Tav catches Icarius' eye and jerks his chin in an invitation. Icarius just shakes his head no, mouth quirked, and goes on nursing his mead. Ah, well, it was probably a bad idea anyway. With his inhibitions down, Tav invites Icarius to dance. Not just to join in on group festivities, mind you. Remember, the crowd has parted, and Tav and Astarian are presently the focus of the room. Tav's inviting Icarius to join him and Astarian. But what would Astarian have to say about all this? I am so glad you asked. Let's talk about it. Astarian and Icarius. I'm going to take a quick sip of my water. Alright. I know, isn't this screenshot great? First, it's important to note that Astarian's perception of Icarius is anything but concrete. Over the course of the story, there's a shifting progression in how he views the Ballspawn, and that view is largely influenced by the lens through which he sees him. And that lens is Tav. How Astarian views Icarius. We can look at this in 3 different stages. The key to understanding Tav, the threat to Tav's life, and then the friendly rival and confidant. At first, Astarian takes interest when Tav brings up Icarius because it provides an opening through which he can glean more insight into Tav himself. First in terms of ways to manipulate him, and later in terms of, dear gods, what is wrong with this man? When Icarius returns from the dead, Astarian struggles to see him as anything but a threat to Tav's life, due to Withers' claim that only one side of the coin can live. Icarius is the wolf to Astarian's sheepdog nature, and only at Tav's request does he ever back off. When Tav's safety isn't at stake, Astarian and Icarius seem to slowly warm towards each other, in their own way. They're less at each other's throats and more at each other's wits, with an underlying sense of trust and respect developing between the two. The key to understanding Tav examples. And we can see a progression in this as well. First, Astarian is driven by self-preservation and a need to manipulate Tav. So this tumble, Astarian says, describe it to me. Don't leave a single detail out. Then he's driven by insecurities about his role in Tav's life. Icarius distracted you, with blood and sex by the sound of it. How did I measure up, darling? Better? Worse? And finally, he's driven by care for Tav's well-being. Now I finally understand. You thought you killed him, didn't you? Icarius? Of course, everything changes when Icarius comes back from the dead. Astarian no longer sees him like a set of thieves' tools with which he can crack open Tav's brain. No, Icarius is a weapon now, whether he means to be or not. And he's aimed at the love of Astarian's life, who, mind you, was just rescued from the hells. Astarian can't afford to spare empathy, let alone companionship, for someone he might need to kill. The threat to Tav's life, example 1. That desiccated skeleton gave you the only answer that matters. He called you and the pretty Ballspawn over there 2 sides of a coin. You were only alive because he was dead. And when you decided to go on living, when you chose yourself at long bloody last, he was meant to stay in his grave where he belongs. Now he's alive, and that can only mean one thing. One of you is going to have to die again to settle the score. And darling, Astarion, rivers will boil, Astarion says, and the skies will turn to glass before I let it be you. Example 2. Tav cuts Icarius's bindings, first the wrist, then the ankles. What are you doing? A voice demands from behind him. Tav turns his head to see Astarion with a crossbow drawn and trained on Icarius's heart. Here, the sheepdog is on full display, but once he realizes Icarius isn't a threat, Astarion does the next best thing in order to protect Tav. I suppose, Astarion says, wrinkling his nose, I'm advocating that we take the powerful sorcerer who's fallen into our laps and point him toward our enemy. Example 3. Astarion looks at the soft place in Icarius's neck, the killing place, where he'd sink in his teeth to rip out the ballspawn's throat. It's his doing. He's alive and Tav isn't. Fate had to take its due, and Tav, sweet fool, handed himself over on a silver platter to settle the debt. If Astarion had succeeded in convincing him to let Icarius die from ceramorphosis, maybe it isn't too late. In the aftermath of Tav's death, Astarion's perception of Icarius continues to be clouded, now by resentment instead of fear, and that blame would have lasted, if not for Tav's choice to rejoin with Lathander, and Astarion's choice to let him go. There's a brief interlude in this second stage, when Astarion believes that the impossibility of Tav and Icarius' shared survival is made possible by the tear in the weave. Their interaction by the fireplace is perhaps the first time Astarion sees Icarius in a less filtered manner. Might I recommend The Waning Moon? You'll feel very much at home among the patrons. They make scintillating conversation. The conversation opens with Astarion comparing Icarius' social skills to that of a zombie, only to find that the ballspawn is just as sharp-tongued and quick-witted. Case in point, our fearless leader, Icarius repeats, the ballspawn, the druid. Is there a reason you're allergic to using people's names when you talk about them? The corner of Icarius' mouth quirks almost imperceptibly in the face of Astarion's silence. Headache already? Astarion asks, galvanized. From what I recall of hangovers, they usually take until the next morning, but perhaps it depends on one's constitution. And the reader should note that galvanize is defined as to stimulate or excite as if by an electric shock. It's kind of gay. Despite the lingering distrust between the two, Icarius and Astarion seem somewhat invigorated by their verbal duel, which brings us to a fundamental pillar of their relationship: enrichment. If you think about it, but not too hard, putting Astarion and Icarius in the same room together is basically like taking a dog to the dog park, or like taking BB to hang out with the boys. Tav and Astarion may match each other's freak, but Icarius and Astarion can match each other's speak. And that allows our beloved vampire to be sated in both body and mind. I met your old lover last night, my erstwhile killer. He's doing well. We talked about you. Here is where we begin to see hints at Icarius falling into the role of unexpected confidant. Of all the party members, Icarius is the only one whom Astarion mentions meeting in his 6 months of mourning. That doesn't mean they are suddenly besties, but it does imply some level of trust and psychological safety between the two of them. It's especially significant that Astarion was able to talk about Tav, because that requires willingly exposing his own vulnerability. Of course, neither Astarion nor Icarius are strangers to each other's vulnerable states. The sounds coming from Astarion are ones you've never heard a man make before. Can only imagine coming from an animal, something wounded and dying. He moves like a puppet, jerky, pulled by invisible strings that originate somewhere outside his body. As he clutches Tav's corpse to his chest, you're struck by the distinct horror of watching a glass sculpture shatter. Tav watches Astarion's face as he takes it in. Icarius's lank, raked-through hair, the tear tracks on those pale cheeks, nails bitten to the quick, pages torn from the book and crumpled. Icarius stares down at his shaking hands. Am I free of him? Can you say without a single doubt that I'll never belong to him again? Vulnerability is a prerequisite to intimacy, and although these instances of vulnerability weren't voluntary, neither man shied away from the other in response. Perhaps my favorite example is this. To Astarian's dismay, Icarius doesn't have the decency to let him fall to the ground. He catches Astarian and they sink down together in the candlelight, beside Tav's corpse, amidst the scattered marble fragments of his god's graven image. The ball spawn bends close. His heart is beating by Astarian's ear, fast and agitated. Find him. Bring him back, and neither of you will ever see me again, I swear. When Astarian opens his mouth, he coughs blood instead of words. Some of it lands on Icarius' face like garish makeup. That's what you get for killing me, Astarian would say if he could. Now put me down. But Icarius doesn't. Let's talk about cognitive dissonance. Icarius' behavior in this moment doesn't fit with how Astarian has framed him. He's the man indirectly responsible for Tav's death, an outlet for Astarian's anger, and really the only one around who can take the brunt of that anger. Petrus is gone, a statue can't feel pain, and a corpse can't hear his rebukes, but Icarius is a living, breathing target. But then he had to go and ruin it by showing Astarian compassion. Behind Icarius' elbow, Astarian glimpses Tav's face, his staring hazel eyes. Let me hold you, Astarian thinks, as if he isn't the one dying. I should have held you when... That dissonance is only furthered as the gesture unearths Astarian's own regrets in relation to Tav. Considering this, it's not very surprising that Astarian would respond bitterly towards Icarius in the moment, but I believe it ultimately sticks with him and shifts his opinion of Icarius towards something more begrudgingly positive. So is to be a stake, is it? How very intimate. Sweet, noble will, taking you into his arms to end your suffering. We also can't ignore how romantic the imagery in this scene is. Being held in someone's arm while surrounded by candlelight. Even Astarian himself, in the Ascendant timeline, notes the intimate nature of being staked by someone who cares for you. But what other grounds are there for a romance between Icarius and Astarian? Let's take a look. He called you in the pretty ball spawn over there 2 sides of a coin. It should be noted that this was Astarian's first time seeing Icarius, and that man was fresh out of sewer at the time. Not only that, but he was sweaty and feverish from early stage seromorphosis. His hair was a limp mess after being drenched by the rain, and his borrowed clothes were little more than stained rags. And yet, Astarian still refers to him as pretty. Astarian looks the ball spawn up and down with an appraising eye. To his disappointment, he can't find anything else to critique. Not a red hair out of place, and Iman's dress finely enough to make Astarian conscious of his own scuffed boots and threadbare shirt sleeves. In the epilogue, Astarian gets to see Icarius in a contrastingly immaculate state. He not only looks him up and down, a behavior commonly associated with attraction, but also finds no flaw in his appearance. Beyond possibly finding him attractive, this also speaks to Astarian and Icarius' shared taste in fine clothing, something that they can bond over together, because Lord knows Tav wouldn't get it. We talked about you, among other things. God, there's so much potential buried in these 3 words. I could easily speculate, but there are only 2 things we know for sure. 1, there was discussion of a painting, either unfinished or not yet started at the time. And 2, Astarian is hesitant to elaborate on this interaction. Let me just do a little bit of speculation, if you don't mind. I see some people saying in the chat that they definitely fucked. I would disagree, actually. Well, I think it's highly unlikely that they kissed or had a tumble, since Astarion was still in the throes of mourning and later realized just how touch-starved he'd been. It's certainly plausible that Icarius offered him a bite, since Astarion had lost his primary blood source. While we have no proof of this happening, it would certainly make a juicy reversal to Astarion's previous claim in 33.16. Don't flatter yourself. I'm not interested in a bite. Not enough meat on those bones for my taste, I'm afraid. Secondly, given Icarius' dysphoria, vivisection scars, and unchosen facial tattoos, matched by Astarion's lack of reflection and ritual scars, I could see them stumbling into a conversation that touches on self-image and hints at their insecurities, something Astarion wouldn't want to dwell on in his prayers to Tav. This theorized conversation could have also led into Icarius offering to paint a portrait of Astarion as a substitute for a mirror, which reminds me of something. By the way, the painting's finished. It's yours if you ever want to pick it up. Perhaps later. I'm lacking a wall to hang it on at present. Icarius takes the mirror from him but holds it face down. I'll look later. His voice is carefully, rigorously polished. Interesting. While we're at it, let's note another moment mirrored between them. There's a limit to how sentimental I can wax over a dead man who tried to take over the world, I'm afraid. But I suppose I have him to thank for your life, and that is no small gift. To that evil bastard, and the one good thing he did for the world. What's that? What do you think? You, of course. The two aren't so different, really, and perhaps that's another reason they've had to work through feelings of hostility. After all, they're still learning to love themselves. And even then, we've learned that insults certainly don't rule out affection. Astarion about Icarius. He's calling himself Finian now. Says he doesn't know if it'll stick. In other words, he's become no less irritating. Sounds a little familiar. Oh, look, here's what Astarion says towards Tav. You're sober enough to be intensely irritating, which means I can have my guiltless way with you after all. Sweet hells, and here I thought alcohol made you less irritating. The look Astarion's giving him now, half irritation, half fondness, all dangerously soft. But we've talked enough about Astarion's complex views of Icarius. How does Icarius feel about Astarion? Well, in addition to enjoying sharp banter with Astarion, risking his safety to help Astarion save Tav, holding Astarion as he died, and gifting Astarion a free custom painting, there are two moments worth examining. Astarion finishes off a glass of disappointing wine, and a pale hand with dark painted nails hands him another. Fellas, is it gay to offer another man a drink? Yeah, it's pretty damn gay. But besides resembling a classic gesture of innocuous enough flirtation, the drink serves as a sign of goodwill, a sort of peace offering that matches with Icarius' request that they be civil. Icarius is taking steps to earn Astarion's companionship, in the same way one earns the trust of a stray cat. It's yours if you ever want to pick it up. Perhaps later I'm lacking a wall to hang it on at present. Wouldn't you know, that makes two of us. Continuing on with the stray cat approach, Icarius offers a gift to Astarion without pressuring him, leaving the choice entirely up to him. And after everything Astarion's been through, choice itself is a gift. Then Icarius says this, and allow me a moment of lunacy, if you will, because I have some thoughts. Wouldn't you know, that makes two of us. Iman rises and tips the remainder of his wine gracefully into a bush. I'll see about that, honeymead. Look after yourself, Astarion. Icarius makes this vague-ass statement, and then abruptly stands to take his leave. Maybe it's incidental, but I can also read it in one of two ways. One, Icarius was worried about Astarian's isolation and used that scheming brain of his to plant the seed of an idea for the two of them to become housemates, ostensibly for the cost savings, of course. Or two, Icarius was crushing on Astarian and realizing the unintended implications of his comment, escaped in a panic while playing it cool. Anyway, on a more comprehensive note, my final piece of evidence in favor of Tavstarius is this. The stages of an enemies to lovers arc, brought to you by 2 random websites with information on the subject. As we can see here, they pretty much meet the criteria. The initial clash and underlying conflict, check. The unlikely alliance over a shared goal, Netherbrain, check. Seeing a different side of each other, check. Developing trust through vulnerability, check. Taking a risk for the other, Icarius, check. Of course, there is a major obstacle to reaching that final stage, the pre-existing relationship between Astarian and Tav. And then there were 3. Let's talk about expanding the relationship, but not before admiring this beautiful art, which I love. Tav can feel Astarian still wrapped around him, watching, taking it in, silent. And slowly, bit by bit, Icarius finds his way deeper. He pulls closer, tighter with each memory Tav gives him. Astarian doesn't make room, but he doesn't push him away either. I love to think of this line as a reflection on how their relationship would grow. Astarian wouldn't welcome Icarius with open arms, it's simply not his nature, but he would accept him. And even better, he wouldn't have to sacrifice any of the space he occupies in Tav's heart in order for Icarius to take his place there too. One does not preclude the other. Icarius hears these words 4 different times in 33.16. It calls back to Withers' response when Tav asked if Icarius was right about the prophecy or just insane, but the repeated emphasis suggests that a deeper significance could be at play. It might be a biased interpretation, but it's still one that I find meaningful. That one love does not preclude the other. He's learned to open his hand and let Tav fly free, secure in the knowledge that he'll return. Tav comes back. He always does. One might argue that Astarian is too possessive to share Tav, but that would be dismissive of his character growth. It's still difficult, still a work in progress, but Astarian has shown that he can let go, and he can trust Tav to step away and still return. If their love can withstand death, fate, and a literal god, it can undoubtedly withstand the added love of an amnesiac artist. And it wouldn't be the first time Astarian has made concessions for Icarius on Tav's behalf. Not because he felt obligated, but because he wants to grant Tav's wishes as an expression of love. But Tav, gods damn him, he so rarely gives Astarian an opportunity to grant one of his wishes, to prove that he can be generous, if only for Tav and Tav alone. Tav asked Astarian to talk to the ball spawn, so he will. But Tav, gods damn him. Again, he asked for so little, and he asked for this, for Icarius' life. From a narrative perspective, it would also be tragically gratifying to see Astarian progress from a mindset that outliving equals winning, secure in the knowledge that he will still have Tav to himself for several hundred years, only to mourn and miss Icarius just as much. But, however, there is a spell that can help though. See clone. Not for fucking purposes. Thank you. Voyeurism as a gateway. We know that 1, in a past life, Icarius enjoyed watching Tav with other men at his parties, and 2, Tav and Astarian are freaks in the sheets and other endless locations. Therefore, it's plausible that they could eventually invite Icarius to watch them in bed together. There's an added benefit to this for Astarian, namely making Tav come undone in front of his ex. This encounter would break the ice, opening the door for them to carefully, consensually, and sometimes impulsively push boundaries little by little until they reach a breaking point, forced to ask, what are we doing? And what do we want? Also, they can help Icarius decide on a name by testing which one sounds best on Tav's lips when he's seconds away from orgasm. So, there's that. Finally, let's recall the facets that align between these three incredible characters, which allow them to relate to each other in a way no one else can. They were each made to serve and used as bringers of death. They each bear scars tied to a dark past. They each had to confront their makers and claim their free will. And they each realized that they were capable of being loved. Thank you. Oh, but also, by the way, if that still isn't enough, here is totally real proof that Tavstarius is endorsed by eyes themselves. As you can see, I said, Tavstarius are in love. Okay, Grandpa, let's get you to bed. Classic meme. And I said, me in 50 years. Wow. 100% intentional. All right, and now a real thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Woo! Tavstarius.